She warned me not to fall for her. But in the end, she was the one who couldn't look away. I first met her on an unusually quiet Saturday morning at the small, sunlit library near the edge of town. I had wandered in with the half-hearted plan of borrowing a few books for the week, not expecting much more than the soft smell of paper and the hush of turning pages. She was standing by one of the tall shelves, reaching for a novel on the top row. Her movements were graceful but deliberate, the sort of calm confidence that drew attention without trying. A lock of her dark hair had slipped loose from behind her ear, and for a second, the morning light caught it, making it shimmer softly. When I stepped closer to reach for a book, she glanced my way. There was no obvious spark, just a brief meeting of eyes that felt oddly grounding. She gave a polite, almost distant nod before going back to scanning the shelves. I found myself strangely aware of the quiet between us, of the way the sunlight slanted across the wooden floor. A few minutes later, as I passed her in the narrow aisle, I heard a soft chuckle escape her. It wasn't directed at me. She'd found a line in the book that amused her, but the sound made the corners of my own mouth lift. It was the kind of laugh that carried years of both restraint and warmth. We ended up at the checkout desk at the same time. I remember fumbling slightly with my card while she placed her book down with an easy grace. The librarian smiled at her in a way that hinted at familiarity, and I caught myself wondering how often she came here. Outside, the late morning sun painted the street in soft gold. I was adjusting my bag when I heard her voice for the first time, low, steady, with a quiet confidence that held just a trace of amusement. "Don't fall for me," she said lightly, almost as if teasing. Yet the look in her eyes was calm and certain. It wasn't flirtation. It was more like she was drawing a quiet line in the sand. I blinked, caught off guard. "I wasn't planning to," I managed to reply, though there was a warmth in my tone I hadn't intended. She smiled then, a brief, knowing curve of her lips, as if she'd heard that answer before. "Good," she said softly. "It's better that way." And with that, she walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume, subtle, like fresh jasmine after rain, and a curious sense that I had just stepped into the edge of something I didn't yet understand. The moment lingered with me for the rest of the day. It wasn't her warning that stayed in my thoughts, but the way her voice had carried both gentleness and a hint of self-protection. I didn't know what stories lay behind her eyes, or why she'd felt the need to say those words. All I knew was that they had settled somewhere quietly in me, like a note in a song I hadn't heard before. The following week, I ran into her again. Not in the library this time, but at the little cafe tucked beside the town square. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when the sunlight turns soft and spills across tabletops like warm honey. I was waiting in line for coffee when I caught sight of her near the window, a paperback open in her hands and a steaming cup sitting untouched beside her. She looked different outside the library. Her hair loosely tied back, a soft scarf draped around her neck, the sleeves of her cream-colored sweater pushed just above her elbows. She wasn't reading so much as staring at the page, lost in thought. I almost didn't say hello, but as I moved past her table with my cup, her eyes lifted and, for a heartbeat, they held mine. There was a flicker of recognition there, not warmth yet, but something gentler than the guarded look I'd seen at the library. "Twice in a week," I said lightly, slowing my steps. "I'm starting to think this is more than coincidence." A faint smile touched her lips, barely there but unmistakable. "Small town," she replied, her tone calm, the words carrying the weight of someone used to chance encounters. I gestured toward the empty chair across from her, silently asking permission. She gave a slight nod, and I sat down, suddenly aware of the subtle scent of her perfume again. That same soft hint of jasmine, mixed now with the warmth of coffee. The conversation started awkwardly, like stones skipping across still water. We spoke of the weather, the town's weekend market, and the books she was reading. But every so often, her eyes softened when she listened, and she would tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear in a way that felt unhurried, almost unconsciously graceful. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing her in small, unexpected places. At the farmer's market early on Saturday mornings, choosing ripe peaches with the careful attention of someone who truly appreciated them. At the library again, this time sitting cross-legged on the carpet in the children's section, flipping through an old poetry book. Even at the same trail where I often went for an evening run, her silhouette framed by the fading light as she leaned on the wooden rail by the lake. Each encounter felt unplanned yet oddly inevitable. We rarely exchanged more than a few words, but each time there was a small, almost imperceptible shift. Her smile lingered a little longer, my greeting came a little more easily. One rainy afternoon at the cafe, we both reached for the same napkin from the counter. Her sleeve brushed against my wrist. A light, fleeting touch, but it carried an unexpected warmth that left me momentarily still. When I looked up, she seemed just as aware of it, though her expression stayed calm. Those early meetings weren't about big gestures or confessions. They were about small recognitions, the kind you don't plan for. A shared glance across a room, a soft laugh at the same line in a book, the way her posture eased whenever she realized it was me approaching. Slowly, the guarded distance I had sensed in her on that first day at the library began to soften, though she still carried herself with the quiet composure of someone who didn't let her heart be swayed easily. Looking back, I think that was when the real beginning took root, not in her warning, but in the simple repetition of seeing each other in the rhythms of ordinary life. It wasn't romance yet. It was recognition and the first fragile threads of trust. It was one of those early autumn evenings when the air carries just enough chill to make you slow down. The cafe by the square had started putting candles on the tables, and the faint scent of cinnamon drifted from the counter. I had gone there more out of habit than intention, expecting the quiet hum of the place to help me clear my thoughts. She was there again. This time, she sat alone at a corner table near the window, her scarf draped loosely over the back of her chair, her hair falling in an unplanned cascade of black waves over one shoulder. The soft glow from the candle caught the edges of her face, tracing a delicate line across her cheekbones. She wasn't reading, just stirring her coffee absently, lost in thought. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to intrude, but before I could decide, she glanced up. Her eyes lingered on me a heartbeat longer than polite recognition. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the empty chair across from her. Felt like an invitation, or at least permission. I sat down, trying not to seem too eager. The clink of the spoon against her cup was the only sound between us for a while. Then, almost unexpectedly, she broke the silence. "You always seem to be here at the right moments," she said, her tone light, though her eyes stayed on the steam curling from her coffee. I smiled, resting my hands around my own cup for warmth. Maybe we're just on the same schedule. Or maybe this town isn't as big as it feels. A quiet laugh escaped her, the kind that doesn't demand attention but still changes the air around it. "Maybe," she said. Then, after a pause, "What brings you here all the time? Not many people your age linger in Café Salon." Her words held a touch of curiosity rather than judgment. "I like the quiet," I admitted. "It's easier to think here. Or maybe it's just an excuse not to go straight home." Something softened in her expression, and for the first time, she looked directly at me, as though searching for something unspoken in my answer. "I understand that," she said quietly. "Sometimes a place like this feels like a pause, between the life you live and the one you wish you were living." That line stayed with me long after she said it. For the next hour, our conversation wove in and out of small topics. Books, the changing season, her favorite corner of the park where she liked to sit in the mornings. But every now and then, a strand of something deeper surfaced. The way she spoke about missing the chaos of the city she once lived in, the wistfulness in her voice when she mentioned her late-night walks along the river back then. I noticed the way she leaned slightly forward when listening, her elbow resting on the table, her chin lightly supported by her hand. Her posture wasn't guarded anymore. It was open, attentive. When I shared a memory of my father teaching me how to fix an old bicycle, she smiled. A real smile, one that reached her eyes and made them glint in the candlelight. There was no declaration, no grand moment that night. Just the quiet, steady sense of two people who had been strangers beginning to see each other as something more than passing faces. As the cafe began to empty, She glanced at her watch and sighed softly. "I should go," she said, standing and wrapping her scarf around her neck. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "It's nice talking to you. I don't usually do this." She left before I could respond, her scarf trailing slightly behind her as she slipped into the cool evening air. For a long time after, I stayed at that table, my coffee gone cold, staring at the candle's last flicker. I realized that in the simple act of talking, of sharing fragments of ourselves, something had shifted, quietly but unmistakably. It wasn't love yet, but it was the first time I thought that maybe her warning, "Don't fall for me," was as much for herself as it was for me. It was the first Saturday in weeks when the sky was perfectly clear, the sun casting a gentle, golden warmth that hinted at the end of autumn. I'd gone to the Riverside Park early, a book tucked under my arm, more out of restlessness than any plan. The air smelled of damp leaves and faint wood smoke drifting from distant houses. I didn't expect to see her there. She was sitting on a weathered wooden bench near the riverbank, her black hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck, a soft cream-colored sweater draping over her shoulders. She was sketching in a small notebook, her brow furrowed slightly in concentration, her long fingers moving with slow, careful strokes. For a moment, I stood still, just watching her. The scene felt like something I wasn't meant to interrupt, too serene, too quietly beautiful. She noticed me eventually, her eyes lifting with a brief flicker of surprise that softened quickly into a smile. She gestured toward the empty space beside her on the bench, and I sat, careful not to crowd her. "You come here often?" I asked lightly, nodding at the sketchbook. "Only when I need to think," she said. "Or when I want to remember why I still love this town." I leaned forward slightly, curious. "What are you sketching?" Instead of answering, she tilted the notebook just enough for me to see a rough outline of the river's curve, the distant line of trees, and the arched stone bridge in the background. Her lines weren't perfect, but there was a quiet grace in the way she captured the scene, like she was drawing what it felt like rather than what it looked like. I couldn't help smiling. "It's peaceful." Something in my tone must have surprised her, because she looked at me then. Not just a glance, but a gaze that lingered, as if she were trying to understand something unspoken. That was the first time I noticed the faintest flush in her cheeks. For a while, we sat without speaking, just watching the river move lazily beneath the morning sun. Our shoulders weren't touching, but they were close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her sweater. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I told you before. Don't fall for me." I turned to her, meeting her gaze. "I remember." She looked away, her fingers tightening slightly around the pencil. "I mean it. I've built my life a certain way. I can't." Her voice trailed off before she could finish the thought. There was something in the way she said it. Not firm like a warning, but fragile, as though she were reminding herself as much as me. I wanted to reach out, to reassure her somehow, but instead I just said softly, "I didn't come here to make things complicated." She gave a small, almost rueful laugh, still not looking at me. "Life has a way of getting complicated on its own." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind that hums quietly between two people who are thinking the same thing but don't yet have the courage to say it. A breeze came up from the river, stirring a loose strand of her hair across her cheek. Without thinking, I reached out and brushed it aside. My fingers barely grazed her skin, but the brief touch felt impossibly intimate. She froze for half a second, her eyes flicking up to mine. Something unspoken passed between us. A spark, fleeting but undeniable, before she turned back to her sketch as if nothing had happened. The rest of the morning passed in easy conversation and long, companionable silences. But as we stood to leave, I caught her stealing a glance at me, her expression softer, less guarded. That look stayed with me the entire walk home. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a promise. But it was the first real crack in the walls she had built around herself. And I couldn't help but wonder if that warning she kept giving me was starting to slip through her own fingers. The rain started just after sunset. A soft, steady drizzle that blurred the glow of streetlights and left the air cool and damp. I had been walking home from the bookstore when I noticed the small cafe on the corner still open, its windows fogged slightly, the inside lit with the kind of warm, golden light that always felt like a refuge. I stepped inside mostly to escape the rain, shaking water from my jacket. That's when I saw her. She sat near the window, her black hair falling in soft waves over the shoulders of a deep blue cardigan. The candle on her table flickered gently, casting delicate shadows across her face. There was an empty cup in front of her, and she was absently tracing circles on the rim with her fingertip, lost in thought. She looked up as the door chimed. Our eyes met, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but as if she'd been quietly hoping for a familiar face. She offered a small smile and gestured to the seat across from her. The cafe was quiet that night, the rain muffling the sounds from the street. As I sat down, I noticed how tired her eyes looked, though the rest of her expression remained composed. "Long day?" I asked softly. She nodded. One of those days where the silence feels heavier than the noise. There was something in her voice, a subtle weight, like a thought half-spoken. I hesitated, then said, "You don't have to talk about it, but if you want to, I'll listen." For a while, she said nothing. Instead, she folded her hands around her coffee cup, staring down at the dark liquid as though the right words might surface there. Finally, she spoke, her tone quiet but steady. "Sometimes I think I've spent so much time trying to be strong for everyone else that I forgot how to let someone be strong for me." I didn't interrupt. I just let her words linger in the space between us. Her eyes flicked up to mine briefly, then back to her cup. "That's why I told you not to fall for me. I don't know how to let anyone in. Not really." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, careful to keep my voice gentle. "Maybe you don't have to figure it all out. Maybe you just start by letting someone sit with you in the silence." Something in her expression softened at that, a subtle loosening of the guarded look she so often wore. The rain outside picked up, pattering softly against the window. A single loose strand of hair fell across her cheek. Without thinking, I reached out and brushed it back, my fingers barely grazing the warmth of her skin. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Her eyes met mine, and there was no mistaking the flicker of something there. Not quite fear, not quite surrender, but a recognition of the closeness between us. She gave a small, almost self-conscious laugh and shook her head, as if to break the spell. "You have a way of making things feel safe," she said quietly. I didn't reply, but I let the words settle between us like a fragile thread. The rest of the evening passed in gentle conversation. Small stories from our pasts, quiet jokes that drew out soft laughter. When the rain finally eased, we stood at the door of the cafe for a moment, reluctant to part. As she stepped out beneath the dripping awning, I held it back for her without thinking. Our hands brushed briefly in the small exchange, and the simple touch carried a warmth that lingered even after we said goodnight. That night, as I walked home under the damp glow of streetlights, I realized it wasn't just the rain that made the world feel quieter. It was the sense that something unspoken had shifted between us, a closeness that neither of us had planned for, but neither of us had resisted. It wasn't a confession, and it wasn't a promise. But it was the first moment that felt like more than friendship, the beginning of something neither of us could quite name yet. The first chill of winter had settled in, the kind that makes the air crisp and sharp against the skin. The town's small library had switched to its winter hours, and the late afternoon light that spilled through the tall windows was tinged with gold, like an old photograph. I had gone there to return a book, but I lingered longer than I intended, drawn to the calm hush of the place. I wasn't surprised to see her there. She was seated by the window in a long, soft gray coat, a cup of tea cradled between her hands. Her black hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands falling free to frame her face. There was a faraway look in her eyes, as if the snowflakes beginning to drift outside had caught her in some private memory. She noticed me approaching, and the faintest smile touched her lips, not bright, but warm enough to make something in my chest tighten. I slid into the chair across from her, resting my elbows lightly on the table. "You always seem to find the quiet corners," I said softly. "Maybe I just like to hide in them." she replied with a small shrug, though her eyes lingered on mine a moment longer than necessary. There was a silence between us then, not awkward but heavy, as if the things left unsaid had begun to take up their own space in the room. I could hear the faint ticking of the library's old clock, the soft rustle of pages being turned at the far end of the room. "I've been thinking about what you said that night at the cafe," I said finally, keeping my voice low, "about how you don't know how to let someone in." Her fingers tightened slightly around her cup. She didn't answer right away, but the way she looked down at the tea, as if avoiding my eyes, told me that the thought had been haunting her too. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I said it because it felt safer. I thought if I warned you, maybe I wouldn't have to face what I was starting to feel." The admission hung in the air between us, fragile and startling in its honesty. I leaned in just a little, enough for her to see that I wasn't going to look away. "You don't have to face it alone." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine then, and in them, I saw both resistance and a deep, quiet longing. The look made my breath catch. It was as if she were standing on the edge of something she wasn't sure she was ready to step into. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The muted light through the window seemed to press in around us, the world narrowing to the small space between our hands on the table. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she reached out, not quite to take my hand, but close enough that her fingers brushed against the back of mine. The touch was fleeting but electric, like a spark leaping across a gap. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, tinged with both sadness and something softer. "I don't know how this happened," she murmured. I shook my head slightly, my voice low but steady. "Neither do I, but I'm glad it did." There was no kiss, no dramatic gesture, just the quiet acknowledgement of something that had been growing between us for weeks, finally given shape in the simplest of touches and words. As we sat there, the snow outside thickened, soft flakes drifting down like feathers. The world beyond the window grew still, and it felt as if the library itself was holding its breath with us. It wasn't a declaration, but in that moment, we both understood that the warnings she had given me, "Don't fall for me," were already behind us. What we had now wasn't something either of us had planned for, but it was real, undeniable, and quietly changing everything. The first true snow of winter arrived overnight, blanketing the town in soft white. By morning, the streets were hushed beneath the powder, and even the distant sounds of traffic seemed muted, as if the whole world had paused to listen. I found myself walking the familiar path to the riverside park, now transformed into a quiet, glistening expanse. The trees stood bare, their branches dusted with snow, and the river moved slowly beneath a thin layer of frost. I wasn't sure if I expected to see her there, but something about the day, the stillness, the way the pale sunlight filtered through the clouds, made me feel as if I would. She was there. She stood near the bench where we had first sat together weeks ago, bundled in a long, deep green wool coat. Her black hair peeked from beneath a soft knitted scarf, and her breath curled in faint clouds in the cold air. She didn't notice me at first. She was gazing at the river, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. For a moment, I simply watched her, letting the sight settle into my memory. The graceful lines of her figure, the quiet strength in the way she stood there, as if bracing herself against the winter air. When I approached, she turned slightly, her eyes meeting mine. There was a hint of surprise, quickly replaced by a smile that felt softer, freer than any I had seen before. "I thought you might be here," I said, my voice low so it wouldn't disturb the fragile quiet of the morning. "I didn't plan to come," she admitted, a small laugh escaping her. "I just needed to think." We stood side by side, looking out at the slow-moving river, the crunch of snow beneath our boots the only sound for a while. Then she shifted slightly, glancing at me from the corner of her eye. "I've been fighting this," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "I kept telling myself it wasn't right, that you deserved someone your own age, that I shouldn't let you in. But somewhere along the way—" Her words faltered, and she looked away briefly. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped wanting to push you away." Her admission hung in the frosty air between us, delicate and real. I took a slow step closer, my breath mingling with hers in the cold. "You once told me not to fall for you," I said gently. "But I think you were the one trying not to fall." A soft, rueful smile curved her lips. "I know. I thought I was protecting myself. Maybe even protecting you. But I think I was just afraid." The vulnerability in her voice was unlike anything I'd heard from her before. I reached out, hesitating only a heartbeat before my hand found hers. Her fingers were cold at first, then slowly warmed as they curled into my palm, as though she had been waiting for the invitation. We stood there in the snow, hand in hand, saying nothing more. The river moved beneath its thin layer of ice, the sunlight breaking briefly through the clouds to scatter across the water like silver. It wasn't a dramatic confession. There were no grand promises or declarations. It was something quieter, more enduring. Two people standing side by side, no longer resisting the pull that had been there all along. As we finally turned to leave, our steps fell in time with each other, our joined hands swinging lightly between us. And for the first time since that warning, "Don't fall for me," I felt as if the walls she had built around herself were gone, leaving something open and real in their place. We didn't need to say the words. In that winter morning's quiet, surrounded by snow and river light, we both knew what they would have been. Revolving hearts, if this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Hit like to show your support, subscribe for more heartfelt age gap romances, and tap the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter of stories that make you feel. Share this video with someone who believes in unexpected love. And let's keep the conversation going in the comments below.